Home Secretary Chris Philp stood in Parliament yesterday to deliver a powerful message that has sent shockwaves through Westminster. His words weren't just political theatre, they were a demand for justice that has been decades in the making. Philp began by addressing the tragic air crash in India and paying respects to colleagues Joe Cox and Sir David Ames before calling for de-escalation between Israel and Iran. But then came the moment that changed everything.
Secretary Chris. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I associate myself with the Deputy Prime Minister's remarks about the tragic air crash in India and, of course, what she said about our dear colleagues Joe Cox and Sir David Ames. I also join her in calling for de-escalation between Israel and Iran, while noting everything possible must be done to stop Iran getting a nuclear weapon. Yesterday, the Leader of the Opposition and I met with survivors and family members of the rape gang scandal. Fiona, Teresa, Lucia and Marlon. They told us how authorities deliberately covered up the systematic rape of young girls and some boys by gangs of predominantly Pakistani heritage men. They covered it up because they cared more about so-called community relations than about protecting vulnerable girls. That is disgusting. The survivors told us they will only have confidence in an inquiry if it is independently led, has full statutory powers, covers all 50 towns affected, including Bradford, if those who covered this up are prosecuted, if foreign perpetrators are all deported, if survivors are closely involved, and if it is set up before the summer recess. Can the Deputy Prime Minister give the survivors and their families those assurances?
Deputy Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, first of all, can I thank him for his tone and putting the survivors and victims at the heart of his question here today. I think it's absolutely right that we all look at what's happened over the last couple of decades, the countless reports that we've had, and we look to implement that. He's absolutely right to also talk about the confidence people must have in that independent inquiry. And the member that my friend, the Shadow Home Secretary, spoke about that earlier this week in regards to Baroness Casey's report. So we will take that forward at speed, Mr. Speaker. It will be independent, it will have statutory powers, and we will implement the J report, which was he will have known about as the Shadow Minister in charge, the Minister in charge at the time, and we'll get on with taking the action. I hope members of his party will take his tone in making sure the whole House put the victims first and we all work together to get to the bottom of it.
Well, I thank the Deputy Prime Minister for her answer. It is vital that scandals like this are never again covered up because of the racial background of perpetrators. And Baroness Casey's report said people who downplay the ethnic dimension are letting victims down, to use her words. So I do have to raise the language the Prime Minister used in January when he, I'm afraid to say, smeared campaigners as jumping on, quotes, a far-right bandwagon, simply for calling for the very inquiry he has now been forced to set up. Standing up for rape victims is not far-right. So will the Deputy Prime Minister apologise for what the Prime Minister said?
Deputy Prime Minister.
Well, I say, Mr. Speaker, that the Prime Minister did not just raise issues but acted on them. He brought the first prosecutions against grooming gangs, called for action to address ethnicity issues in 2012. And the honourable member will know that the data that the previous government collected was inaccurate and not complete. And Casey recognised this, and it's one of the recommendations that we will be taking forward. The Prime Minister made those comments specifically about Tory ministers who sat for years in the government and did absolutely nothing about this scandal.
The interview exposed the government's hypocrisy. They now admit the need for a national inquiry after months of dismissing calls for exactly that. Reynolds couldn't explain why anyone looking at the evidence wouldn't immediately support such an inquiry. The work done by GB News and other outlets clearly demonstrated the scale of the problem. When asked about timeline and funding for the new inquiry, Reynolds deferred to a later Home Secretary statement. This lack of concrete details suggests the government is still scrambling to develop a credible response after being forced into action. Before we wrap up, if this kind of political accountability coverage interests you, don't forget to subscribe to stay informed about these crucial developments. The broader implications are staggering. This isn't just about past failures, it's about ongoing risks to children across Britain. The systematic cover-ups, the prioritization of political correctness over child safety, and the failure to address immigration-related crime patterns represent a betrayal of the most vulnerable members of society. What emerges from this parliamentary exchange is a government in crisis mode, forced to abandon previous positions and scramble for credibility on one of the most serious issues facing Britain today. The survivors deserve better than political spin and delayed justice.